There is a particular kind of fear that combat veterans rarely speak about openly. Not the fear of dying. Experienced soldiers learn to carry that weight. The specific fear that makes hardened men go quiet decades later, that appears in their memoirs as careful, clinical understatement, is the fear of facing something they could not predict. Something that absorbed punishment, studied its own wounds, and came back fundamentally changed. By the summer of 1944, that something had a name. The Americans. This is the story of how one of the most battle-tested armies in human history came to genuinely dread a force it had once dismissed with casual contempt, and what that transformation reveals about the psychology of institutional adaptation under extreme pressure. The contempt, and why it made complete sense. Before we talk about fear, we have to talk about contempt, because the Germans were not wrong to have it, at least not initially. In 1939, the United States Army ranked 19th in the world by total size. Not 19th among great powers, 19th overall, behind countries like Portugal and Romania. German intelligence analysts who compiled assessments of American fighting capacity in the years before Pearl Harbor reached conclusions that were remarkably consistent with each other and, at the time, entirely reasonable. American factories produced consumer goods, not weapons. American officers had no living combat experience against a peer opponent. The nation had not fought a serious war in over 2 decades, and even that war had ended with American forces arriving late, contributing to the final campaigns rather than driving them, Nguyen suffering casualty figures that were modest compared to the European powers who had spent 4 years destroying each other. Adolf Hitler reinforced these professional assessments with ideological ones, and this matters psychologically because ideology does not update the way professional judgment does. Hitler genuinely believed that national strength flowed from cultural and ethnic cohesion. Germany possessed that cohesion. America, in his framework, was a fractured collection of competing identities held together by nothing deeper than geography and commerce. Under the crushing pressure of modern industrial war, he argued, that kind of society would simply come apart. He told his inner circle that he saw little future for the Americans. He was not performing confidence for the cameras. He believed it. The German officers who had faced American troops in 1917 remembered enthusiastic but tactically unsophisticated soldiers, willing to advance frontally, unable to sustain complex coordinated operations, brave in the way that untrained men sometimes are before experience teaches them what they should actually be afraid of. The idea that their sons would be fundamentally different seemed implausible to men who had spent their entire careers studying the relationship between training, experience, and battlefield performance. 3 enemies, 3 kinds of fear. Before we get to Kasserine and everything that followed, we need to understand something that gives this story its full weight. The Germans did not experience all their Allied enemies the same way. They categorized them, not officially, but in the way soldiers always categorize opponents who are trying to kill them. In memoirs, interrogation transcripts, and post-war testimonies, 3 distinct portraits emerged. The British they called professional, methodical, bound by doctrine, and deeply experienced. When British forces were preparing an offensive, German intelligence could read the signs days in advance, the logistical buildup, the preliminary bombardment patterns, the predictable sequencing of infantry and armor. You could respect the British the way you respect a skilled craftsman. You knew what they were going to do. You prepared accordingly. The Canadians they called ruthless. There was a particular ferocity in close-quarters Canadian combat that unsettled German defenders in ways that went beyond tactical calculation. At the sharp end of the line, Canadian infantry fought with a grim, almost personal intensity that German veterans noted repeatedly. The Canadians did not seem to be performing aggression. They seemed to mean it. But the Americans required a different vocabulary entirely. Overwhelming, unpredictable, relentless, and above all, terrifying, not as individual soldiers, but as a system, a machine that learned, a machine that, once it found a weakness in your defenses, did not file a report about it and wait for orders. It exploited the weakness immediately, told every adjacent unit what it had found, and pressed the advantage until there was nothing left to press against. Understanding that distinction is what this entire story is really about. Kasserine. When every assumption was confirmed on February 14, 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel launched his armored forces through Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. What followed appeared to validate every German assumption about American fighting capacity in a single catastrophic week. The American Second Corps was commanded by Major General Lloyd Fredendall, a man whose failures would later become a case study in military leadership schools worldwide. He dispersed his forces across a 30-mile front, leaving units isolated and unable to support one another. He positioned his personal headquarters in an elaborate underground bunker carved into a mountainside 70 miles behind the front, so far from the battle he was supposed to be directing that his grasp of the tactical situation was essentially non-existent. Engineers who should have been preparing defensive positions were instead excavating his command post. When Rommel struck, the results were exactly what German intelligence had predicted and worse than American planners had feared. Panzer columns rolled through gaps in the line that should never have existed. Artillery positions were overrun before they could fire effective salvos. Infantry units broke without orders and fled, abandoning equipment worth millions of dollars in the desert sand. American tanks, caught in the open without adequate infantry support, burned under the accurate fire of German 88mm guns, whose reputation had already crossed every front in the war. 6,500 American casualties in 6 days. 3,000 soldiers captured. D. Rommel wrote to his wife that evening with something approaching clinical satisfaction. The Americans, he observed, had not yet learned how to fight. Omar Bradley, who would later command the largest American army in history, called Kasserine probably the worst performance of United States Army troops in their entire history. The assessment was harsh. It was also fair. German commanders drew what seemed like obvious and permanent conclusions. The Americans lacked the internal hardness that comes only from sustained combat. Their material abundance could not compensate for tactical incompetence and leadership failure at every level. Their diverse population produced soldiers without the cultural cohesion that German planners believed was the foundation of genuine fighting spirit. Rommel wrote that the Americans would require months, see perhaps years, to develop into opponents worth serious respect. He was wrong about everything except the months. If you're already sensing that something is about to shift dramatically, you're right. But before we get there, take a second and subscribe. If military history told through the psychology of the people who lived, it is what you're here for. Most of our subscribers found their way here through a single video. This might be yours. The mechanism of transformation. Here is where the story becomes genuinely instructive, because what happened next was not inevitable. Most armies that absorb a defeat of that magnitude spend the following weeks managing the psychological and organizational damage. They protect their existing systems. They look for explanations that don't require them to fundamentally change. But the Americans did the opposite, and the speed with which they did it genuinely alarmed Rommel, who was paying close attention even when his superiors were not. Within days of the Kasserine disaster, Dwight Eisenhower relieved Fredendall and dispatched George Patton to take command of Second Corps. What Patton did in the weeks that followed was not primarily tactical, it was psychological. He understood that the men who had broken at Kasserine were not broken men. They were men who had never been properly formed in the first place. And he understood that the kind of formation that holds under fire is not simply a product of training exercises. It is a product of standards applied without exception and consequences that are real and immediate and personal. Wood Patton demanded things that seemed almost theatrical to outside observers. Polished brass, helmets worn at all times, neckties in the desert heat, officers fined personally for uniform violations. His profanity was legendary. His intensity bordered on something clinical. But the psychological effect was precise and deliberate. He was communicating to every man in the formation that the standards of this army applied to everyone at all times, regardless of rank or comfort or the chaos of their recent defeat. He was teaching them that discipline was not a peacetime formality. It was the difference between a unit that holds and a unit that runs. German General Günther Blumentritt, who would later be interrogated by British military historians after the war, He described Patton as the most aggressive armored commander the Allies produced, a man of lightning-like action and incredible initiative whose operations impressed German commanders enormously because he came closest to their own concept of what a classical military commander should be. He even improved on Napoleon's foundational principle of speed, Blumentritt said. Speed, and then more speed. The man the Germans respected most on the Allied side was the man who had been handed the wreckage of Kasserine and turned it into something unrecognizable in a matter of weeks. El Guettar, the moment the math changed. 4 weeks after Kasserine, barely a month. On March 23, 1943, Patton positioned his forces at El Guettar and waited for the German counterattack he knew was coming. The 10th Panzer Division, 50 tanks, experienced crews, commanders who had beaten this enemy before, advanced through the morning mist with the casual confidence of a formation that expected to scatter its opponents as easily as it had in February. What they found was something they had never encountered before. American mines disabled the lead panzers, channeling the following vehicles into prepared kill zones. Tank destroyers opened fire from concealed positions with accuracy that surprised German crews who had expected the same disorganized resistance as before. Infantry held their ground with discipline that had been entirely absent a month earlier, maintaining unit cohesion under pressure and firing with deliberate effect rather than panicked waste. And then the artillery began. 30 German tanks were left burning on the approach to the pass. When infantry caught in the open were pinned and slaughtered by massed fire. When German prisoners were interrogated afterward, some of them wept openly. Several told their American captors that this was the first time in the entire war they had been stopped by artillery and infantry alone, without significant armor support. The same men. The same approximate equipment. 4 weeks of genuine transformation. What Rommel was witnessing, though he could not yet fully articulate it, was not simply improved morale or more aggressive leadership. He was watching a learning organization complete its first real iteration cycle. The Americans had identified exactly what had failed at Kasserine and systematically corrected it. They had not made excuses. They had not protected the officers responsible. When they had not waited for a comfortable moment to implement changes, they had learned, quickly, institutionally, in ways that German planners had no model to predict or account for. What Patton understood, and what the Germans never fully credited until it was far too late, is that institutional failure is recoverable when the people inside the institution understand what actually failed. Kasserine was not a failure of American courage. It was a failure of American systems and American leadership. Once that distinction was made clearly and acted on without delay, everything changed. Keep that idea in your mind as we move through the rest of this story, because it is the thread that connects every major American military achievement from Tunisia to the Rhine. The weapon that kept them awake at night. German veterans who survived the war, when interrogated by Allied historians in the years afterward, were asked variations of the same question. What did you fear most? Not as individuals, but as professional soldiers facing the Americans specifically. The answer was remarkably consistent across rank, branch, and theater. Not American tanks, though the Allies eventually fielded them in overwhelming numbers. Not the fighter bombers that owned the daytime sky over every German formation after 1943. What German veterans described, in memoirs, in interrogation transcripts, in the post-war studies compiled by military historians on both sides, was American artillery. Not simply because there was so much of it, though there was more than German logistics could ever match. What they described was the system behind the artillery, on something they had never encountered on any other front against any other opponent. The American fire direction system had been developed quietly at Fort Sill, Oklahoma during the interwar years, developed not by genius, but by engineers who asked a deceptively simple question. What if any observer could call fire from any gun in range without a prior established communication chain? The answer was a centralized fire control architecture that was genuinely unlike anything any other army had built. Where British and German systems tied forward observers to specific batteries, and where concentrating fires from multiple units required time-consuming coordination through multiple chains of command, the American system allowed a single observer anywhere on the battlefield to request massed fires from an entire battalion or an entire division and receive it in approximately 3 minutes. German systems required 10 to 12 minutes to achieve even a fraction of that coordination. The practical difference between 3 minutes and 12 minutes, when measured in human lives and tactical opportunity, was catastrophic. A Piper Cub, a fragile, unarmed observation aircraft with fabric covering and a top speed barely faster than a fast automobile, became one of the most feared objects in the German military's entire experience of the Western Front. German soldiers learned to read the sky with a specific kind of dread. When one of those tiny planes began circling overhead, they knew exactly what came next. Within minutes, shells would begin falling with an accuracy that seemed almost personal. The observer would adjust fire methodically, walking the bombardment across German positions until nothing remained but craters and shattered equipment and silence. The Americans then refined this system into something they called time on target, a technique that multiplied the psychological terror of their artillery beyond anything the raw tonnage numbers could explain. Batteries of different calibers, positioned at varying distances from a single target, would calculate their firing sequences with precise coordination so that shells from dozens of guns, fired at different moments, arrived at the target simultaneously within a window of just a few seconds. For German soldiers in the impact zone, there was no warning. On no first shell to send men diving for cover before the main barrage came. Just silence, and then instantaneous, overwhelming obliteration appearing from nowhere, as if the sky itself had made a decision about them. Then came the proximity fuse. And this is where the terror became something close to existential for the German infantryman. The Americans invested over $1 billion developing a miniature radar set small enough to fit inside a standard artillery shell. The fuse detected the ground as the shell descended and triggered detonation at the optimal height for maximum fragmentation, typically around 30 feet above the surface. As shells that would normally have buried themselves in soft ground before exploding now burst in the air and showered shrapnel downward onto troops in foxholes and trenches that had previously offered reasonable protection. The effect was 5 to 10 times more lethal than conventional artillery fire against dug-in infantry positions. The foxhole had been the infantryman's sanctuary since the beginning of modern warfare. American artillery made it a trap. German prisoners captured during the Bulge reported that some soldiers chose to charge directly into American positions rather than remain in their holes waiting for the airburst shells. They preferred the possibility of being shot in a direct assault to the certainty of being shredded by fragments falling from above with nowhere to hide and nothing to be done about it. General Patton wrote to the War Department with characteristic directness about the new weapon's effects. The new shell with the funny fuse, he reported, is devastating. If the engineering of fear interests you the way it interests us, the specific mechanics of how weapons and systems get inside the minds of the people facing them, drop a comment below with the word system and tell us what other military innovations you want us to break down this way. We read every comment and we build our content around what this community actually wants to explore. Normandy and the psychology of adaptation. When American forces came ashore on June 6, 1944, they faced a tactical problem that briefly gave German commanders genuine hope that the pattern might reverse itself. The bocage country of inland Normandy, ancient earthen hedgerows, some 15 feet high and centuries old, topped with dense vegetation, turned every small field into a natural fortress. Tanks that tried to climb over the banks exposed their thin belly armor to waiting anti-tank guns. Infantry advancing without armor support was slaughtered by interlocking machine gun positions that German defenders had prepared with characteristic thoroughness. The offensive ground toward a halt in July, buying yards at the cost of thousands of lives. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in the West, built his entire strategic response around this stalemate and around the distinction between his two primary enemies. He would screen off the British sector, where Montgomery's set-piece attacks were predictable days in advance, while concentrating mobile reserves against the Americans, and where the terrain so strongly favored the defense. He admitted later that his strategy rested on a calculated bet. He knew what the British would do before they did it. He was never certain what the Americans would do until they were already doing it. His calculation about the British was not wrong. His calculation about the Americans was catastrophically wrong. Across the American sector, something was happening that no German model could account for. Units that were stuck, tank crews, infantry squads, engineers, were independently developing solutions without waiting for orders from higher headquarters. They were experimenting with demolitions, with firing sequences, with entirely new coordination between armor and infantry that existing doctrine had never specified because no one had anticipated this exact terrain problem. Uncritically, the solutions were spreading laterally through the formation, unit to unit, through informal networks, without waiting for division or corps headquarters to review and approve them. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 2nd Armored Division fashioned steel prongs from German beach obstacles left along the Normandy coast, Rommel's own obstacles as it happened, and welded them to Sherman tank hulls, creating devices that could tear through hedgerow banks at ground level rather than climbing over them and exposing their vulnerable undersides. General Omar Bradley saw a demonstration and immediately ordered mass production. Within 3 weeks, 3 out of 5 tanks in 1st Army carried hedgerow cutters fabricated by ordnance units working around the clock. The device was kept strictly classified to preserve the element of surprise. The American military culture did not simply tolerate this kind of grassroots improvisation outside official channels. It actively sought it, rewarded it, and industrialized it. That is a rarer institutional quality than it sounds, and it was something the German military, for all its tactical brilliance, had never quite built into its own culture at the same scale. Cobra, the Falaise Pocket, and the Complete Reversal Operation. Cobra launched on July 25, 1944, with a demonstration of combined arms power that left survivors permanently altered in how they understood modern warfare. 1,500 heavy bombers carpet-bombed a rectangle 3.5 miles long over Panzerlehr Division, one of the finest armored formations in the German military, and composed of veteran cadres with years of combat experience accumulated across multiple fronts. General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzerlehr, would spend years afterward writing 20 separate manuscripts attempting to describe in clinical terms what happened to his division in a single afternoon. The bombing killed over 1,000 soldiers from Panzerlehr alone within hours. When dazed survivors emerged from their shattered positions to face the American ground assault, they no longer commanded a coherent fighting force capable of coordinated resistance. A division that had entered the bombardment with approximately 45 operational armored vehicles emerged with 7. Through the gap, Cobra tore in the German line. On Patton's Third Army poured into France and conducted one of the most breathtaking mobile campaigns in the history of warfare, covering more ground in less time than any comparable operation before it, appearing behind German defensive positions, cutting communications, overrunning supply depots, and trapping entire formations before they could organize coherent retreats. The encirclement at the Falaise Pocket in August destroyed the German 7th Army as an effective fighting force and ended any realistic German hope of stabilizing the front in France. Approximately 60,000 German soldiers were trapped in a shrinking perimeter under continuous attack from ground and air. 10,000 died in the pocket. 50,000 surrendered when further resistance served no rational purpose. C. Eisenhower walked the battlefield 2 days after the pocket finally closed and wrote that the scenes could only be described by Dante. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. Heinz Guderian, Germany's foremost theorist of armored warfare, the man who had developed the Blitzkrieg concepts that had conquered France in 1940, was asked after the war for his professional assessment of American operations in France. He admitted that Patton had conducted a good campaign. Then he added that from the standpoint of a tank specialist, he had to congratulate him, because Patton had acted exactly as Guderian himself would have acted given the same circumstances and the same opportunities. Coming from the man who invented modern armored warfare, that was not a compliment. Rather, that was a professional acknowledgement that the student had surpassed the teacher without ever having studied under him. The Bulge, Hitler's last miscalculation. December 1944. Hitler assembled the last strategic reserves of the German military, including elite SS panzer divisions carefully rebuilt after their mauling in France, and launched them into the Ardennes forest against what intelligence indicated was the weakest sector of the Allied line. The offensive was premised on a fundamental assumption about American character, that the same soldiers who had broken at Kasserine nearly 2 years before would break again under the shock of sudden assault by veteran formations. Hitler was operating on 2-year-old information. The offensive achieved complete tactical surprise when it struck on December 16th. German forces attacked through fog and snow that grounded Allied aircraft and temporarily negated American air superiority. The initial assault shattered thinly held American positions along a front of 50 miles and sent shockwaves through Allied command structures all the way back to Eisenhower's headquarters. But what happened in the days that followed demonstrated how thoroughly and irreversibly the American military had transformed. At Lanzerath Ridge, 18 men from a single intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, joined by 4 artillery observers, held a position against approximately 500 German paratroopers for nearly 18 hours. These were not conscripts or garrison troops. These were Luftwaffe paratroopers, elite soldiers, formidable opponents by any professional measure. The 18 Americans held anyway, and disrupting the carefully planned German timetable, buying time that proved decisive for the sectors behind them. They would later be recognized as the most decorated American unit of their size for a single engagement in the entire war. SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper commanded the Spearhead battle group that was supposed to reach the Meuse River bridges on the first day of the offensive. Instead, his advance took 36 frustrating hours just to reach the small town of Stavelot, the same distance German armored forces had covered in 9 hours during the victorious 1940 campaign through these same Ardennes forests. American engineers systematically demolished every bridge in his path. Soldiers emptied fuel depots and set them ablaze rather than let a single gallon of gasoline fall into German hands. And every delay cost Peiper irreplaceable time and fuel he could not afford. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions established positions that completely blocked the entire 6th SS Panzer Army, the main German effort, containing some of the finest remaining formations in the Wehrmacht. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Youth formation composed of soldiers indoctrinated since childhood and among the most fanatical in the German order of battle, was mauled so thoroughly in its repeated assaults against those positions that it never recovered as an effective fighting force. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded by overwhelming German forces that sent a formal ultimatum demanding surrender to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe considered the message briefly and responded with a single word: nuts. His defenders held their shrinking perimeter through days of bitter fighting in freezing conditions until Patton's Third Army executed one of the greatest logistical feats of the entire war, pivoting an entire army of over 100,000 men 90 degrees northward and advancing over 100 miles through winter conditions to relieve the siege on December 26th. Winston Churchill addressed the House of Commons the following month and spoke of the battle with unusual generosity toward his American ally. "Care must be taken in telling our proud tale," he said, "were not to claim for the British Army an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and what he believed would be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." Here is the question worth sitting with as we move toward the conclusion of this story. The Germans had been right about the Americans at Kasserine. Those soldiers in February of 1943 really were inexperienced, poorly led, and incapable of standing against veteran formations. The catastrophe was genuine. What the Germans failed to account for was not American potential in the abstract, it was the specific mechanism by which that potential could be released. If you want to keep exploring how military institutions, organizations, and individuals process failure and rebuild from it, subscribing now is the simplest thing you can do. These are the stories we build this channel around. What the system actually was. When German officers tried to articulate after the war why American forces were different, they kept reaching for the same language: overwhelming, relentless, unpredictable, terrifying in their firepower. But these descriptions pointed at effects without identifying causes. The cause was something more specific and more instructive than any of those words suggest. The Americans built integrated systems that multiplied individual performance beyond what individual performance alone could ever predict. The artillery fire direction system that turned any single observer into a conduit for hundreds of guns. Close air support integration that put fighter bombers on target within minutes of a ground request. So full motorization that gave American divisions a sustained operational tempo. German formations dependent on horse transport could never match in extended operations. And logistics, the supply chain that made German officers describe American material availability in terms that approached disbelief. When German tanks were destroyed, new tanks arrived at American depots within days from factories running 3 shifts around the clock. When ammunition was expended, more arrived within hours on truck convoys that kept coming regardless of losses. The flow never stopped. It never even visibly slowed. Battery C of a single American field artillery battalion fired its 300,000th round in the period between June 1944 and March 1945, an output that would have exhausted the ammunition reserves of an entire German corps. So if for the Rhine crossing in March of 1945, over 2,700 American guns opened fire at a rate exceeding 1,000 rounds per minute. German artillery, forced to conserve every shell and operating a logistically nightmarish mix of captured weapons from across occupied Europe, each requiring different ammunition calibers and different maintenance, could not begin to approximate that output. The Americans standardized everything. A shell manufactured in Ohio fit a gun assembled in Michigan, operated by a crew trained in Oklahoma. The same industrial logic that had rationalized American automobile production now rationalized the production of military power at continental scale. And underneath all of it, sustaining all of it, what was the institutional culture that treated failure as information rather than verdict, that demanded honest diagnosis rather than protective explanation, and that gave individuals at every level the authority to implement solutions without waiting for permission from above. That culture was what Rommel had failed to see at Kasserine. He had seen the Americans at their absolute worst and assumed he had seen them at their normal level. He had no framework for an army that treated its own catastrophic defeat as a curriculum. The soldiers who fought from Kasserine to the Rhine went home to ordinary lives when the war ended. They became farmers and factory workers and fathers. They did not think of themselves as having done anything extraordinary. They had simply done what the moment demanded, absorbed failure, understood it clearly, corrected it without sentiment, and kept showing up. German commanders who survived the war and wrote their memoirs struggled to explain the transformation because their professional models had no category for it. They had measured American potential by American performance in the earliest stages of combat and concluded that the gap between the two could not be closed quickly enough to matter. They were wrong about the timeline by a margin that cost them everything. The army that fled at Kasserine and the army that broke the Wehrmacht in Normandy and held the line at the Bulge were composed of many of the same men. What changed between February 1943 and the summer of 1944 was not their courage. They had always had that. What changed was the system around them, and their understanding of what that system required from them at every level, and from the sergeant welding scrap metal to a tank hull in a Normandy field to the general pivoting an entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter. They were not supermen. They were people who rose to meet an extraordinary challenge when their moment of testing arrived, and in doing so, they gave an army that had conquered most of Europe a reason to be genuinely afraid. If this story gave you something worth thinking about, share it with someone who takes history seriously. Like the video, so these stories keep reaching the people who want to understand not just what happened, but why it happened and what it actually means. And leave a comment below telling us which moment in this story hit hardest for you. We read every single one, and your comments shape what we cover next.